Welcome to Geekview Tavern. Put down that crucifix and order yourself a Bloody Mary as we go creeping into this interview with Tomb of Dracula writer Marv Wolfman. Seldom referenced today, Marvel's Tomb of Dracula comic book series by Marv Wolfman, Gene Colan, and Tom Palmer was both a great read and very popular. One of the most important comic series of the 1970s, heavily influenced an entire generation of aspiring comic book creators. I'm your host and bartender, Dave Olbrich, the former publisher of Bravura Comics and the Ultraverse. Remember to like the episode, leave a comment below, share it with friends, and please subscribe. Okay, Skeeter, hit the intro.
Hey, I'm Karyn Keene, the creator of the Dracula Files, and you are watching Geekview Tavern.
Welcome to Geekview Tavern. I'm Dave, and this is my co-host, Tom Mason. Wave to the people, Tom. Tom Mason's the creator of Dinosaurs for Hire, personal editor and writer who's done comics and books and TV shows and animation. But our very special guest today is Mr. Marv Wolfman. Thanks for joining us, Marv. We really appreciate it. Marv is a luminary in the comics industry, writing and editing on hundreds of comic books for Marvel and DC, and a few other publishers as well. From New Teen Titans to Superman to Fantastic Four to Spider-Man, and a title that's a favorite of both Tom and I, Marvel's Tomb of Dracula. So Marv, what made Tomb of Dracula a unique comic book concept when it was first launched?
When Marvel did Tomb of Dracula, before I got on it, the idea was to have a continued series of horror stories, but nobody had ever done that before. All the horror books that were out there were all little short stories with supposedly twist endings.
Right. Yeah. I don't think I would have pursued a career in comics if it hadn't been for Tomb of Dracula.
Oh.
I just think that's it's one of my favorite things ever, and so
Mine too. Mine too.
What I love about it is the same reason why I love Master of Kung Fu, is that you even though I know that Kung Fu is Doug Mensch, but with Tomb of Dracula, you took a villain character and you built an entire supporting cast so that the story is about the villain, but the villain is not in everything.
Yeah.
And you can maneuver the cast around in a bunch of different stories, and the cast itself is excellent.
Thank you. That's very much what Bram Stoker did in the original novel. Have you ever read that?
I have not.
I have not either.
First of all, it's really good.
Really?
All
right.
Really good. Dracula appears in maybe 80 pages out of a 400-page book.
Wow.
And not only that, but you don't know anything about Dracula because the book is told as a series of mail, letters, police blotters. They were all by other people. You never know anything about Dracula, just about his effect on other people. And my reaction to that was I could write about real people.
Sure.
I could write about characters, and I based the concept off of the original novel and took it in my own directions, of course.
Right.
But the idea of concentrating on the effect Dracula has on people rather than who Dracula is would be more interesting to me. Again, if you say too much about who Dracula is, I think he becomes ordinary.
Right.
The idea is to keep him a mystery. You shouldn't know what he's doing. Those people don't know. They have not the slightest idea who Dracula is or why he's there or anything about him. They just know that he's killing them. So I love that approach. It's informed almost everything I've ever written, in that I always played off how other people react to the character.
It was a really entertaining read.
Well, fortunately, and you know what it's like, I was allowed to pretty much control the book. They don't do that now. I was my own editor.
Yeah.
I always made sure other people read it to make sure I didn't make mistakes, or I wrote something ridiculous or something. I was my own editor, and I tended to like my stuff, so I approved everything.
Yeah, So
Yeah.
that brings up something interesting, at least to me. My vision in my head of the Marvel offices at the time that you were an editor is that it was just nuts.
Yeah, it's
And I don't
very
mean
much.
I don't mean fun like in the Stanley bullpen, image that he projected, but I mean just like nuts with a bunch of crazy guys writing as much fun stuff as they possibly could, and sort of living and working in the office.
working into the middle of the night and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Is
That's
that
pretty
even
much
close to real?
That is real. That's exactly what it was. Stan's view was, despite what everybody thinks today, they all think that Stan was was telling everybody what to do. He was like this dictator. He wanted us not to follow what he did. He kept saying, "Don't follow my style. Come up with your own," as he did. He wanted us to do other stuff. He was not precious about his work. He wanted us to try be as experimental as he was, but in our way. So
Right.
I was allowed to do, frankly, totally crazy stuff in Dracula that I never would have been allowed to do had I been working for an editor.
Right.
Because every issue of Dracula was a challenge to the comics code.
Did you
And
find
we-
yourself writing it differently because of Gene? Like Gene Colan's participation, I assume.
Yeah,
At some point, had to really start informing the writing, right?
It informed it very much so. I had already worked with Gene on Tower of Shadows,
Okay.
and when I heard that he was the artist on Tomb of Dracula, and he got the job obviously before I did because I started with issue 7 and he started with issue 1.
Right.
I was so happy because Gene could draw real people.
Yep.
And I knew that freed me up to write the type of stories I wanted, which did not fit into the Marvel template at that particular point. It did, but it didn't, because the Marvel feel was about the characters, it was about everything, and that I continued. But it was, I think if another editor had been in charge, they wouldn't have let me do a lot of the weirder stuff that I was doing at the time.
Yeah, there was no
you-
generic faces in Gene Colan's world.
No,
Every single one of those characters were idiosyncratic in their own way. It was really
So my
beautiful to
plots,
watch.
yeah, my plots were always played towards that because I knew that he could do human expressions. I
Sure.
didn't do that. Gil Kane was my favorite artist growing up, from his stuff in all the science fiction books and Green Lantern and all of that stuff. But I would never have given Gil the same freedom because his characters didn't have individual emotions. They were better drawn, cookie cutter characters.
Yep.
Gene had real people, and that allowed me to write stories about what the best I could about people.
Yeah.
Did you? Here's a dumb question.
Bring on the dumb questions.
Was you
No problem. I'll give you a dumb answer.
excellent? Since you were the editor of your own book, did you have any control over the coloring as well for Tomb of Dracula? Because it stood out from the other Marvel books.
Once I became editor of Tomb of Dracula, I think Tom Palmer did most of the coloring
Okay.
until he quit at some point. So Tom, being an artist, had a very clear view of what he wanted, and it was very different from a lot of the others.
So what was it like when they came to you and said, Marv, hello, would you like to be editor-in-chief? What was that like?
Well, you have to remember, I was already the editor of all the black and white magazines at Marvel.
Okay.
So I had been doing that for over a year, editing something like 14, 15 black and white magazines.
Wow.
And Len was the editor at this particular point on the color comics.
Okay.
When he left, for me, I was the next in position to take over the color books. And then I actually hired Archie Goodwin to replace me.
Okay. What was the thought process behind that? Because you did it for what, 2 years?
I did a couple of years, yeah. I was at Marvel for 8 years, mostly on the black and white magazines and on the color books for a year or two. I mean, Archie was like the best.
I have a great deal of affection for Archie Goodwin, for sure. Yeah.
Besides being one of the nicest people ever in the history of comics,
Yeah,
he was also
true.
one of the best writers in the history of comics. But I knew that he was probably not happy where he was, and if I could get him to be an editor at Marvel, that would be so great because he could teach anybody. He was so good at what he did.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
he was at Warren at the time, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was at Warren when he began, and then was back at Warren later on.
Right. Okay.
So what did you learn anything from that experience? Like what did you take away from the experience of being editor-in-chief for a couple of years?
I think at another time period, if I were older, I was still very young, I was not interested in doing business, and the Marvel was bought by a company called Cadence.
Yeah.
Right.
And my job became much more business driven than creative, and I hated that. I couldn't stand it. I just really despised it. So it was not a good time. I finally went back to freelancing. When I was on the black and white magazines, I loved it because I was the editor of them and I was given a freedom to do it. But I was only doing the creative.
Is there anything in the back of your brain or in the front, for that matter, in the drawer somewhere that you really want to still do, like a pet project that you want to
Well, I've been trying to get a novel worked because that way I could do it at my own speed. I'm not as fast as I used to be.
Yeah.
And I've written a bunch of novels, so it's not like it would be something new, but I haven't gotten the plot worked out yet. That takes a lot longer to do.
Right, and would it be based on anything we already know, or it would be original?
No, there's no reason to, if I'm going to do a novel, I'm going to do it on my own creation.
Yeah, I think that's smart.
I've done novelizations.
I know, I've read some of them.
Okay, so, but I want to do my own.
Yeah, for sure.
And take the time to do it the way I feel it should be done.
Yeah, that's great.
You had a lot of stuff made out of the characters that you created, games and toys and stuff. Do you have a favorite, like something that's really, really cool that was made of something that wouldn't be around if you hadn't created the character?
Well, obviously, you look at the Teen Titans.
Yeah.
The fact that it is in 3 separate type of TV material, TV shows and such. That wouldn't have existed if I didn't come up with Raven and Cyborg and Starfire and such, and if I didn't team up with George to make it look just gorgeous, beyond belief gorgeous. So Teen Titans is one. I love the idea of my characters being picked up and done well. I thought the first Blade movie was perfect.
Right.
That was pretty much 90% the Blade that Dream and I had come up with. Crisis, the fact that this CW did Crisis is still unbelievable to me. They did their version of it and even brought me in on it.
I was gonna say, you had a cameo on that, right? You actually appeared on camera, right?
Yeah, and I worked with the writers and I wrote one of the episodes, or part of one of the episodes.
Ah, nice.
Mark Guggenheim was wonderful, and then they asked me to actually play myself as a character, which I'm not used to.
You're a perfectly fine character. You're short selling yourself, Marv. Come on.
I'm not somebody who pushes myself personally.
Right.
I push my character, I push all of that stuff, but I'm not that good at being on camera. But it was a lot of fun. I actually managed to remember all my lines.
There you go. So in '93, there was a earthquake and it damaged your house. And
then some foolish company. I forget who they are.
Yeah, who the hell were those guys?
What a bunch of morons!
Morons. Just had me live there.
The comic book jacket.
That's right.
Yeah, I don't get it. Somebody needs to send them to somebody older to explain why you don't do that.
Here's the great thing about that. There are only like a handful of stories of my time in comics that I get to like dine out on, and I'll get to say just very casually, oh yeah, there's that time Marv Wolfman used to come out and hang out in my office, and I could walk out my door and I would see Marv sitting at a desk working, and then you would hear, what? There'd be this sort of burble, like, how does that even happen? The explanation is never as interesting as the fact that I could walk out and say hi to Marv, but I get a kick out of telling that story 30 years later.
I was so thrilled that you had me come up to the offices and give me a space there during the earthquake, because I couldn't have worked at home.
What was the difference between the Malibu offices and the Marvel and DC offices?
Actually, it felt a lot more like the early Marvel offices.
Right.
Because they moved from an open environment, which Malibu was,
Yep.
to a to individual, everyone had their own room. DC was always that way from day one. They always had every editor or every 2 or 3 editors would occupy a single room.
Right.
I like Marvel in the early days because it was exactly the same way that you guys did with Malibu. It was opened.
Marv, you mentioned that when you started, you were basically one of the young kids.
Yeah.
My impression of DC at the time was that it was the cast of Mad Men, basically. Did you ever feel like a kid? Did you ever feel like...
Oh, yeah. When we became professionals, when we were fans just going on the tour, no, everything was, we were just going on a DC tour. Thing was, when we started, we were required to be dressed up in business dress.
Right.
All the editors were. Over years, as more of us came in, we started to take off the tie.
Right.
We started to take off the sweater, the jacket, or whatever else. We knew we finally won when Julie Schwartz didn't wear his tie anymore. When Julie did that, we knew.
So who was your gang of guys that were kind of coming in at the same time, like the guys that you hung out with, Len and Archie?
Yeah.
But who else?
Well, Bernie, I gave him, I think, some of his first 2 assignments.
Bernie Wright.
Were over my scripts. They were these Kane's True Case files.
Yeah.
And I wrote those, and he drew them. Mike Kaluta, Jeff Jones, a little bit later, Walt Simonson, Wheezy, Louise Jones. Every month there would be a first Fridays at Louise and Jeff's house in Manhattan, and the entire industry would get together, go to the party. So it was the first Friday you were looking forward to, and all of us were there, from the younger guys to the older guys.
That sounds really cool.
It really was.
It does.
It really
It sounds epic as well.
Yeah,
it was, and getting to meet people that we had been fans of, and we didn't take it for granted. We totally.
How often do you wish that you had an iPhone with you so you could take 1 million pictures of everybody?
Oh God! Every so often I'm asked, "Do you have a photo of you from the Tomb of Dracula days?" No. Never thought to take.
I wish I had a picture of every lunch I ever had when I was editing.
Yeah.
No.
I don't think anybody took photos at the party because, again, you had to pay for developing and all of that stuff. I'm sure none of us had that much money.
What questions are you holding in your pocket there, Mr. Tom, that you'd like to ask Marv?
The path that Marv took to get into the industry is an interesting one that no longer exists.
Right.
And if you were starting out today, what do you think your path would be to be in comics?
I think when I was getting into comics, there were very few young people getting into comics at that particular point.
Right.
And the older creators were retiring or being retired.
Right.
That allowed me, and also we had a lot of these horror books, the monster books, that were 5, 6, 7-page stories.
Right.
Which they gave to all of the younger talents to learn our craft on. Right. That doesn't exist today. I don't know if I would have ever been able to sell anything today. I never thought I was a very good writer, but I always thought I was a good storyteller. Fortunately, I had a lot of good story ideas. That kept me in it until my craft actually picked up as well. Best material is when the creators, the writer and the artist and the editor are trying to make a book their own. And then you get really good stuff.
Yeah.
I think that wraps it up.
I think so too. So thanks for everybody for coming to Geekview Tavern. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much, Marv. Give us a wave. Say goodbye to everybody and call it a day. Right.
Marv, it's been an absolute delight.
Thanks for visiting Geekview Tavern. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and click the bell to get notified. Come back soon.